Well, greetings, and welcome to the show. This is Wrong Place, Right Crime. I am your host, Frank Zafiro, and this is a different kind of episode. Today we have Glenn and Jenn hosting the podcast. Now, a couple of things. They're here to discuss the release of my revised and expanded edition of Under a Raging Moon. This is the first book in my River City series of police procedurals. This new edition is the Canon edition. Now, Glenn and Jenn will take a deep dive into it. This pair of hosts are completely virtual. Yes, you heard me. This is an experimental episode, using artificial intelligence hosts to highlight the changes in this new edition. I did not write the script of this show. Instead, I uploaded the original and new revised books and asked them to examine the differences. The result is what you're about to hear. Why do this? Well, because it is fun to experiment. Mostly, though, because it seemed like an interesting way to avoid asking you to listen to me monologue on the topic. So, without further ado, here are Glenn and Jenn.
All right, so are you ready to go deep with me tonight?
Always up for a good deep dive. What do we got?
Tonight, we are going deep into Under a Raging Moon. So I want you to just imagine for a second that you are digging through some old dusty boxes in your attic. Or maybe, cleaning out the very back of a closet you haven't touched in years.
Oh, man, I already know where this is going.
Right. And you find a journal, like something you wrote maybe 20 years ago. Yeah. And you pull it out, you wipe off the dust, and you crack it open.
Expecting to find, this brilliant raw version of your younger self.
Exactly. You think it's going to be so deep. But instead, as your eyes scan the page, your stomach just kind of drops. You completely cringe.
As you realize you were seeing the whole world in such unbelievably simple terms.
Yes, exactly. Like in your head back then, the heroes were purely good, the villains were purely evil, and the incredibly complex, messy gray areas of actual human existence just didn't register at all.
They just weren't there.
Right. So what would you do in that moment? Would you just slam it shut, shove it back in the box and pretend it never existed? Or would you actually take a red pen, sit down and rewrite your own history?
That is such a compelling thought experiment. Because, we are so conditioned to view published art as a permanent record.
Like it's carved in stone.
Exactly. It's cement that's been poured and allowed to set. We treat early works as historical artifacts that shouldn't be touched. But human perspective isn't concrete. It's fluid. It evolves.
Yeah, the person you are at 25 is practically a stranger to the person you are at 45.
Completely. And when a creator actually decides to take a jackhammer to that set cement, to break it apart and pour the foundation all over again, the resulting contrast tells us so much.
It tells us more about the human condition than the actual story itself, honestly. And that is the exact mission for today's deep dive.
I'm really excited for this one.
Me too. We are stepping into that space between the past and the present. We are examining an evolution.
We're diving into Frank Zafiro's gritty police procedural, Under a Raging Moon.
But here is the hook. We actually have two completely distinct regions of this novel on our desk right now.
Which is pretty wild.
It is. We have the original text, which was first drafted way back in 1995, and then published by a small press in 2006. And sitting right next to it, we have the heavily revised 20th anniversary edition, published in 2026.
Which presents us with a truly rare literary artifact, honestly.
Yeah.
Just to give you some geographical and temporal context here, this narrative is set in the fall of 1994.
In River City, Washington, right?
Exactly, River City. And it is a highly tactical, really boots-on-the-ground look at the River City Police Department. We follow the graveyard and day shift officers as they hunt down this violent, totally unpredictable armed robber dubbed Scarface.
Right, so the premise itself is a very classic, high-stakes police thriller.
It is, but the execution of that premise, specifically the psychological underpinnings of the people wearing the badges, shifts incredibly drastically between these two editions.
Because Zafiro didn't just go back and, fix a few typos for the anniversary release.
Yeah, definitely not.
And this is crucial for you to understand. Zafiro was a police officer himself. He served from 1993 to 2013, eventually retiring as a captain.
Which totally changes the lens of the writing.
Absolutely. So when he revisited this book, he added nearly 20,000 words.
Just to visualize that, 20,000 words is roughly the length of an entire novella, just seamlessly woven into the existing narrative structure.
It's massive, and his goal wasn't to throw in more car chases or like bigger shootouts. He completely overhauled the emotional psychology of these characters.
He dragged the text away from those standard testosterone-heavy 90s action tropes.
Yes. And he forced it to confront the profound and honestly often devastating humanity of police work.
The contrast is just stark. I mean, you have a 1995 draft written by a rookie cop who is still fresh on the street.
Viewing the world through that adrenaline-fueled lens of pursuit and capture.
Right. Then you have the 2026 edition, revised by a retired captain with decades of command experience. He has systemic observation now and accumulated empathy.
The changes reflect this massive maturation in both storytelling craft and just basic human understanding. Think about it like renovating your childhood home.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. The foundation is exactly the same. The street address hasn't changed. But when you walk through the front door, the interior walls have been completely knocked down.
You see totally different rooms.
Yeah, spaces that used to be these dark, shallow closets have been opened up to reveal entirely new depths, shadows, and dimensions. The original builder just didn't have the tools or the blueprint or honestly the life experience to create that kind of nuance back in the 90s.
And those new dimensions are built entirely out of character psychology.
Yeah.
The structural bones of the plot, the hunt for James Mace, the armed robber,
Space, yeah.
right, Scarface, and the specific localized tragedies that hit the precinct, all of that remains totally intact. But the emotional architecture supporting that plot has been fundamentally reinforced.
So we are going to look at how that emotional architecture was rebuilt today. We're going to examine how these flat caricatures became desperately complex human beings.
And how the silent burden of leadership actually plays out behind closed doors.
Plus the ultimate quiet cost of asking ordinary people to just step into the dark every single night.
It's a heavy cost.
It really is. But to even understand the depth of this 2026 edition, we first kind of have to unpack exactly why an author would feel compelled to dissect his own published work.
Yeah, the source material is remarkably transparent about this. The 20th anniversary edition includes an acknowledgement section where Zafiro basically drops any pretense of authorial ego.
Oh, he is so brutally honest in that section.
He really is. He candidly admits that his first draft, written in '95, was, in his words, embarrassing when compared to the later novels in his River City series.
He actually says that for 2 solid decades, whenever readers would ask him where to start reading the series, he hesitated to point them to Under a Raging Moon.
He felt this nagging need to attach a caveat.
Yeah, like he had to warn them, hey, just push through this one. My writing gets a lot better in book 2 and 3.
Which requires a significant level of self-awareness. When an author has, over 50 novels to their name, looking backward can be incredibly uncomfortable.
I can only imagine.
Right. He recognized that while his original plotting was sound, the pacing of the manhunt worked, the execution just completely lacked the psychological nuance he developed later in his career.
He notes that the structural bones of that rookie draft were literally showing through the skin of the story.
Yeah, he says it needed to be sanded down and repainted.
But adding 20,000 words is like taking a sledgehammer to it, Not just sandpaper.
Definitely a sledgehammer.
In the original version, he admits that really only the main characters had any three-dimensional qualities at all.
And the rest of the cast. He jokes that they basically came straight from central casting.
Right, you had the generic gangbanger, the officious, pencil-pushing bureaucrat, the hot female love interest, just very standard tropes.
But in the 2026 version, he takes those exact same characters and injects them with massive flaws, insecurities, and these deep contradictions.
And one of the most revealing ways he actually achieves this is through a highly technical shift in narrative perspective.
Specifically during Chapter 10.
Let's talk about Chapter 10. This is the funeral of a fallen officer. In the 2006 edition, Zafiro utilized a technique known as a floating omniscient point of view.
Okay, let's pause and actually break down what that means for someone who doesn't, spend their time analyzing literary mechanics. What is the actual experience of reading floating omniscient?
The easiest way to conceptualize it is to imagine a drone camera hovering over a large crowd, in this case, a police funeral.
So the narrator is entirely detached and all-knowing.
Exactly. It can swoop down and jump into anyone's head for a sentence or two. We hear Officer A thinking about the weather, then the camera seamlessly pans over to Officer B thinking about his boots.
And then it glides over to the grieving widow.
Right. It was an incredibly common style in the 80s and 90s commercial fiction, particularly in these sprawling techno thrillers or procedurals. It gives the reader a very wide cinematic view of an event.
But the trade-off is intimacy, right?
Yes, because Zafiro explicitly notes that over the years, he grew to absolutely detest that floating mechanism.
So for the 2026 edition, he completely strips that omniscient narrator away. He grounds the entire funeral scene, lock and key, inside the perspective of one single character.
Sergeant David Poole.
And this choice is paramount to understanding how you write trauma. When you use floating omniscient, the grief is distributed across a crowd. It feels broad, but it remains incredibly shallow.
You are basically observing sadness from a safe distance.
Exactly. But by locking the reader entirely behind the eyes of Sergeant Poole, who's a man already cracking under immense psychological pressure, the grief is no longer a spectacle. It becomes claustrophobic.
Wow, claustrophobic is the perfect word for it.
You aren't watching a funeral anymore. You are experiencing the suffocating, inescapable weight of death through the nervous system of a man who is actively crumbling under it.
Right. It forces you to endure the trauma rather than just passively witness it. But look, I have to play devil's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
When I first read about him making these massive structural changes to an already published book, my mind immediately went to the ethics of an author, George Lucasing their own work.
Oh, yeah. The special editions.
You know exactly what I mean. You fall in love with a piece of art. Maybe it's a little clunky. Maybe the dialogue is a bit cheesy. But it's authentic to the era it was created in.
Right.
Is it really fair to the original readers, the people who actually bought that small press run in 2006, to heavily alter the canon? The creator just steps back in 20 years later and says, actually, you know that thing you liked? That wasn't the real version.
It's a debate that happens constantly in archiving and media preservation.
Yep.
Who fundamentally owns a story once it's consumed? The person who wrote it or the audience who internalized it?
Exactly. That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
But the more I actually sat with what Zafiro wrote, the more I realized there's a fundamental difference between what he did and what we usually complain about with those retroactive edits.
How so?
Well, when a film director goes back and digitally inserts like a bunch of CGI aliens into the background of a 70s sci-fi movie, they're just playing with expensive new toys. It doesn't deepen the narrative.
It usually just distracts from the emotional core.
Totally. But Zafiro didn't go back and add more laser sights or bigger explosions to the bank robbery. He added human psychology.
He looked at a character like Sergeant Poole and realized, I didn't have the emotional capacity to give your pain the respect it deserved the first time around.
Yes. So I argue that adding this specific kind of psychological texture actually honors the reader's investment. It's not just a cosmetic facelift. It's rewarding the reader for caring about these people in the first place.
That is a crucial distinction. It's an empathetic excavation. He is unearthing what was always implicitly there but never fully realized.
Empathetic excavation. I love that phrasing.
And honestly, no single character in this novel benefited more from that empathetic excavation than Lieutenant Alan Hart.
Oh man, Lieutenant Hart. The absolute embodiment of the angry police captain trope.
Oh, 100%.
In his revision notes, Zafiro is brutally honest about this guy. He admits that in 1995, he wrote Hart as this completely cartoonish, pencil-pushing weasel.
And the reason is pretty simple, if you think about it. As a 20-something patrol officer on the street, that is exactly how Zafiro viewed his own command staff.
Right. To a guy getting shot at in an alley, the lieutenant is just the annoying guy sitting in the air conditioning, making your life harder by rejecting your reports for spelling errors.
The perspective of the frontline worker is inherently adversarial to middle management. It just is.
It totally is. But 2 decades later, Zafiro had actually worn those captain's bars. He had sat in that air-conditioned office.
And that lived experience completely altered the DNA of Alan Hart in the text.
Let's actually map out where Hart sits in this ecosystem, because it really sets up the central conflict of the department.
Okay.
Hart is the ambitious, highly political lieutenant, while the street officers are focused entirely on, just surviving their next 12-hour shift. Hart's brain is occupied with municipal liability.
He's organizing task forces, answering to the city attorney.
Managing the public relations fallout of literally everything his officers do.
Which naturally puts him on a violent collision course with the veteran street cop.
Oh, constant friction. And the prime example in the text is his relationship with field training officer Thomas Chisholm.
The 2026 edition brilliantly expands upon this incredibly tense confrontation between Hart and Chisholm regarding a struggling rookie named Maurice Payne.
The context for this clash is pure chaos. Payne and Chisholm are in a patrol car that gets absolutely shot to pieces by Scarface during a pursuit.
Glasses flying everywhere. It's terrifying.
And Payne gets lightly wounded by some shrapnel. Chisholm, who is this hardened, old-school veteran, treats it with complete battlefield pragmatism. He basically says, patch it up, get back in the fight.
But Hart calls Chisholm into his office and basically tries to yank Chisholm out of the training program because of how he handled the rookie.
And the dialogue in that office crackles. It represents two entirely incompatible philosophies of law enforcement.
Chisholm operates on a pure warrior mentality. I mean, his exact line to Hart is, "I train cops, not altar boys."
Which is such a tough line.
It is. In Chisholm's mind, the street is a war zone. If you want a 22-year-old kid to survive it, you have to teach them to anticipate violence, to be aggressive, and to prioritize survival above all else.
Right, because policy manuals don't stop bullets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Hart fires right back with the municipal reality of policing in the 1990s.
He says, the chief doesn't want trainers who generate complaints.
He is looking at the department as an institution that has to survive politically, not just tactically.
Now, in a standard crime thriller, and certainly in the 2006 draft, the reader's instinct is engineered to side entirely with Chisholm.
Because Chisholm is the one out there actually risking his life. Hart is safe behind a desk worrying about paperwork.
Right. Hart is positioned purely as an antagonist hindering the heroes. But the 2026 edition introduces this brand new, quiet scene that completely shatters that assumption.
This is one of my favorite editions in the whole book.
Same here. Zafiro takes us out of the precinct entirely. He shows us Hart at home, in his den. He's out of the uniform. He's pouring himself a glass of very expensive scotch.
And we are introduced to his wife, Marianne.
This domestic scene is just a masterclass in establishing stakes.
We quickly learn this tiny, heartbreaking detail. Hart had purchased that specific bottle of scotch years ago, saving it to celebrate a future promotion.
But on this night, he isn't celebrating. He has cracked it open to numb a profound, crushing sense of failure.
And to understand that failure, we really have to look at what Hart was doing just hours before. He was standing at the scene of Sergeant David Poole's suicide.
An event that essentially drops an emotional bomb on the entire precinct.
And then Poole's ex-wife, Sherry, arrives.
This is the woman who left Poole, but she is utterly hysterical. She's trying to tear past the yellow police tape to get to the house. So who steps up? Hart, the bureaucrat.
Hart physically intercepts Sherry. He takes her by the arms. He leads her away from the scene to the curb.
And Zafiro explicitly notes that Hart stands there and lets her sob uncontrollably onto his shoulder for 40 solid minutes while they wait for her family to arrive.
40 minutes. Imagine the physical and emotional weight of holding a screaming, shattered human being for that long while everyone else just watches.
It's unimaginable. And we see the cost of being that containment vessel when Hart is in his den with Marianne. He tells her that he knew Sherry had left Poole, but looking at her on the curb, she didn't look like someone who had moved on.
And Hart is spiraling. He's agonizing over whether he missed the warning signs.
He asks himself if he saw Poole staring blankly into space at the precinct and just filed it away as divorce stress because he needed the sergeant to keep the shifts running.
Marianne's response is so grounded.
Yeah.
She provides the exact reality check that leaders in crisis desperately need.
She looks at him and says, "You're his lieutenant. You're not his doctor. You're not his priest."
She reminds him that he managed Poole's professional performance, which was his duty, but he had absolutely no way of seeing into the man's soul.
It's an essential absolution, and it perfectly encapsulates why Hart behaves the way he does at the precinct.
It really does.
Specifically so that men like Chisholm have the operational freedom to hunt a guy like Scarface.
It doesn't absolve Hart of being petty or overly ambitious at times, but it forces the reader to respect him as a vital, load-bearing pillar of the institution.
And since we are already talking about the devastating fallout of Sergeant Poole's suicide, we really need to rewind the clock and look closely at Poole himself.
We do. Because expanding David Poole's character arc is arguably the darkest, most compelling achievement of this 20th anniversary edition.
Poole serves as the emotional anchor of the tragedy. To understand the terrifying nature of his death, we have to examine the slow, agonizing erosion of his life leading up to it.
Poole is fighting a losing war on two fronts simultaneously, professional and personal.
Professionally, his career has completely stalled out. He was passed over for promotion, and the sting of that is magnified because he wasn't passed over by a stranger. He was leapfrogged by his former friend, Alan Hart.
The text reveals that Poole actually spent hours helping Hart study for the lieutenant's exam.
They were close.
They were. But the moment Hart pinned those lieutenant bars on his collar, The friendship vanished into department hierarchy, and Poole was left feeling like a used, discarded stepping stone.
And personally, his foundation has completely crumbled. His wife, Sherry, didn't just leave him, she left him for another man.
The narrative describes Poole walking through his empty house, noting that it is full of ghosts that were still alive somewhere else.
It's a brilliant, agonizing phrase.
He is mourning a life that still exists, just without him in it. The humiliation of abandonment compounding the grief of isolation.
We see this isolation manifest perfectly in a brutally quiet locker room scene. It's the end of shift. Officer Carl Winter, who's just this genuinely warm, caring guy, walks up to Poole.
Poole is just sitting on a bench, staring dead-eyed into his open locker. Not moving, not changing clothes.
Winter tries to throw him a line. He invites Poole out to Duke's, the local cop bar, to grab a beer with the squad.
And Poole, without even looking at him, in this dry, hollow voice, just says he's too tired.
And Winter knows it's a lie. He can feel the darkness radiating off Poole. Winter stands there, debating whether to push harder, whether to demand that Poole come with them.
But he chooses not to, operating under the assumption that if he pushes, Poole, who is technically his superior officer, will just snap at him and pull rank.
So Winter walks away.
Later, at the bar, Winter mentions this interaction to the other guys.
And Ridgway just casually drops this incredibly dark line. He says, "I'm surprised he hasn't eaten his gun yet."
It's framed as gallows humor, but underneath that cynical joke is a terrifying, unspoken truth. They all see him sinking, which exposes a tragic paradox at the core of police culture. These men and women are highly trained to intervene in the crises of total strangers. They are conditioned to physically insert themselves between danger and civilians without hesitation. Yet, when one of their own brothers in blue is in a psychological freefall, the deeply ingrained culture of stoicism, of emotional compartmentalization, completely paralyzes them.
The department teaches them tactical rescue, but provides absolutely zero vocabulary for emotional rescue.
And that failure of vocabulary leads directly to the end of Poole's shift. Zafiro strips away the clinical police report nature of suicide.
He reframes it not just as an act of violence, but as the final, desperate expression of a man whose internal capacity for beauty was systematically suffocated by the daily ugliness of his reality.
The aftermath is just a gut punch. A mail carrier happens to look through the front window the next morning and sees the horror. The call goes out.
And then you have Gio and Ridgway, the guys who were just joking about him at the bar, forced to stand guard at his front door while the county detectives process the blood inside.
Which brings us to the systemic reality of this tragedy. In psychological circles studying law enforcement, suicide is often referred to quietly as the policeman's disease.
Zafiro is using Poole to force the reader to look at the extreme, lethal isolation of the job.
Think about what actually kills David Poole.
Yeah.
It wasn't a bullet from the armed robber they are hunting. It wasn't a gang member.
No. I actually want to push back on the way society typically frames this. Whenever we hear about someone taking their own life, there is often this subtle, unspoken narrative that it was a moment of personal weakness.
That the guy just couldn't hack the pressure anymore.
Right. But reading Poole's internal monologue, I don't see weakness at all. I see a catastrophic structural failure by the police department itself.
What do you mean structural?
Look at the machine we put these people through. We build a system that demands they compartmentalize absolute, unspeakable horror on a daily basis. You pull a dead child out of a car wreck, put it in a box in your brain.
You get shot at by a teenager, put it in the box.
You walk into a house and see a husband beating his wife, box it up. We demand that they become these impenetrable steel vaults of trauma so they can show up for their next shift.
But the system provides absolutely zero release valves for the pressure building inside that valve.
Exactly. When Poole's marriage imploded, the department offered no support. When he was passed over for promotion, there was no psychological debriefing. We engineer them to hold immense, crushing pressure, but we refuse to install a pressure relief valve because it costs too much money or it looks soft.
So when the vault finally inevitably explodes, we have the nerve to call the steel weak.
No, the engineering was flawed from the very beginning.
That is a phenomenal critique of the institutional mindset. The department's infrastructure is entirely designed around physical survival, bulletproof vests, tactics, firearms training, and legal liability. It completely ignores the psychological maintenance required to survive a 30-year career of constant secondary trauma.
Exactly. And speaking of the trauma required just to survive the shift, I want to move from the silent, decades-long internal destruction of an older sergeant to the incredibly loud, chaotic external pressures faced by the younger patrol officers.
We need to look at the crucible of the street.
Specifically through the eyes of Officer Katie McLeod.
This is a vital pivot in the narrative. If Poole represents the long-term erosion of the soul, Katie McLeod represents the acute, terrifying crucible of split-second decision-making.
Through her, we see exactly how the threat of imminent violence fundamentally alters a person's humanity in real time.
Her character arc really kicks into high gear during this incredibly tense foot pursuit.
She is chasing their primary suspect, the armed robber Scarface, through a dark, sprawling construction lumberyard. It's a total maze of shadows and stacked wood. She doesn't know where he is.
And she experiences this moment of absolute, terrifying hesitation.
The mechanics of that hesitation are crucial to understanding her psychology. She's chasing him, he vaults over a fence, he fires blind shots back at her.
In the chaos of the pursuit, there's a half-second where he turns. His arm lifts, and she has her weapon drawn and pointed right at him.
The entire world narrows down to her front sight post. But she doesn't pull the trigger. She freezes.
Why? Because the lighting was terrible, and she couldn't definitively read the threat.
She couldn't tell for absolute certain if he was pointing a gun at her or just turning his body.
And what makes Zafiro's writing so effective here is that he doesn't just focus on the action. He explores the agonizing psychological aftermath of that non-decision.
Fast forward a few hours to 05:15.
The adrenaline of the chase is burned off.
Katie is sitting completely alone in her patrol car outside the station. The only light is the green glow of the dashboard. And she is looking down at her hands, and they are shaking.
It's not a massive, dramatic shake, but a fine, untrustworthy tremor in her fingers.
She tries to do the tactical breathing exercises the rangemaster taught her in the academy, but it completely fails to calm her nervous system.
The text dives into her thoughts here, and it's fascinating. The police academy drilled her endlessly on the use of force continuum.
For those unfamiliar, the use of force continuum is the standard policy guideline that dictates how much force an officer can legally use against a subject.
Ranging from simple verbal commands to empty hand control to pepper spray, all the way up to lethal force, depending on the level of resistance.
Right. They made her shoot paper silhouettes on a well-lit range until her muscle memory was flawless. They made her memorize the precise legal definitions of perceived imminent threats.
But what did they leave out? They never prepared her for the terrifying, soul-crushing realization that when the paper target is replaced by a living human being in the dark, she might be the kind of cop who hesitates.
That specific flavor of self-doubt is paralyzing for a police officer.
It's important to note that she isn't primarily afraid of the criminal shooting her. She is terrified of her own moral compass.
She acutely recognizes the absolute finality of her weapon. Once a bullet leaves the barrel, no amount of regret or policy review or apologies will ever pull it back.
That immense burden of taking a life is pressing down on her conscience, and it overrides her tactical training.
And as if that isn't enough to process, her personal life is simultaneously imploding. She was just brutally dumped by her fiancé after a year and a half together, and he gave her absolutely zero explanation.
Which leaves her psychological defenses completely stripped away.
And there is no pause button. She has to put the heavy-duty belt back on, go back out onto the street, and immediately handle a highly volatile domestic violence call.
If we contextualize this within the psychological toll of policing, particularly for female officers who frequently have to navigate intense physical disadvantages by relying heavily on advanced de-escalation and communication tactics, we see that Katie is constantly, obsessively evaluating the morality of her actions in real time.
She possesses a hyper-awareness of consequence.
This empathy makes her an exceptional, forward-thinking police officer, but it exacts a massive, exhausting toll on her daily psyche.
And what makes her character arc so compelling within the broader novel is the sharp contrast between her internal processing and the men around her.
Katie's hyper-awareness and visible vulnerability stand in stark opposition to the expected, hardened male bravado on the force.
Okay, let's bring this entire deep dive into focus and synthesize the journey we've been on today. We started by looking at a hypothetical box in the attic, the premise that Frank Zafiro didn't just casually republish Under a Raging Moon, he fundamentally renovated it.
He didn't just add 20,000 words to pad the page count. He injected 20 years of lived command experience, profound empathy, and hard-earned, bitter wisdom into a story that desperately needed it.
The transition from the 2006 edition to the 2026 edition perfectly mirrors the maturation of a police officer over a long, arduous career.
It is the movement from the black and white, tactical certainty of youth where villains are just evil bad guys to be chased and brass are just annoying weasels to be ignored, to a profound, tragic understanding of the gray areas. It fundamentally changes how you view the flawed, breaking human beings behind the badge.
Which leaves us with a lingering, provocative question. It's something we didn't explicitly debate today, but it is baked into the ink of every single page of this novel.
And it's an important one.
When a society asks ordinary men and women to step out into the darkness every single night to absorb the absolute worst of human behavior on our behalf, and they come back to us fundamentally changed like Poole with his crushing, lethal isolation, who is ultimately responsible for the pieces of their humanity that get left behind in the dark. Is it the rigid, bureaucratic police system that builds them into vaults and breaks them? Or is it the citizens who sleep peaceably in their beds, completely ignoring the cost while it happens?
A heavy, absolutely necessary question for anyone who benefits from that protection.
I want you to really think about that the next time you hear a siren fading into the distance in the middle of the night. Because just like that old cringy journal in your attic, the reality of the people writing the story is always much more complicated than the simple version we tell ourselves.
So there you go, folks. Glenn and Jenn and their examination of the new, revised, and expanded edition of Under a Raging Moon. I hope you enjoyed this experimental episode. I'll be back next time to discuss the future of the podcast. Until then, this is Frank Zafiro, reminding you that sometimes you gotta be in the wrong place to write crime.